Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Dennis. I serve as Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's winter keynote reading and discussion with Lydia Conklin. Sitka is located at Cascade Head on the north central Oregon coast and resides on the unceded traditional lands of the indigenous people now represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. There is so much to learn. Just one way that we can all do that is, especially if you are visiting Sitka or this region soon, I really encourage you to visit the Chuchala Museum and Cultural Center at the Grand Ronde. It's just a really vibrant place and community. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest moderator and reader. What we're going to do tonight is after my introductions, Lydia will start things off and read, and then there'll be an interaction between our guest moderator and Lydia. And then if you have insights or questions you want to share, you can use the chat or the Q&A function to do that, and we'll just weave those in as we go. Okay. Callum Angus is a trans writer and editor living in Portland, Oregon. He's the author of the story collection, A Natural History of Transition, published by Metonymy Press in 2021, and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in Transgender Fiction, the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction, and an Oregon Book Award, Ken Kesey Award in Fiction. Callum holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a BA in geography from Mount Holyoke College, and has taught writing at Smith College, UMass Amherst, and Clark College in Vancouver, Washington. Lydia Conklin is an assistant professor of fiction at Vanderbilt University. Previously, they were the Helen Zell Visiting Professor in Fiction at the University of Michigan. They've received a Stenger Fellowship in Fiction at Stanford University, a Rona Jaffe Writers Award, 3 Pushcart Prizes, a grant from the Elizabeth George Foundation, Creative and Performing Arts Fulbright to Poland, work study and tuition scholarships from Breadloaf, and fellowships from McDowell, Yaddo, Degrassi, Hedgebrook, and the James Merrill House, the Vermont Studio Center, VCCA, Lighthouse Works, Bush Creek, the Santa Fe Art Institute, Caldera, the Sitka Center, and Harvard University, among others. So welcome, Callum. So grateful to have you guest moderating. And please, everyone, give a warm Sitka welcome to tonight's keynote speaker and reader, Lydia Conklin.
Yay, thank you so much, Allison. And thank you so much to Sitka for having me. It's been so wonderful to get to come back even in a virtual manner, because I spent so much time there, and it's such a magical, inspiring place for me where I did so much good work, and I really miss it a lot. And I hope I get to go back in person sometime. But I thought I would start by reading a short section from the first story in the book called Laramie Time, and then me and Callum will have a conversation, and I'll read a few other little bits as we go. So this story is called Laramie Time. Maggie and I had been living in Wyoming for 3 months when I finally agreed we could get pregnant. We were walking on a boulevard downtown over snow that was crunchy and slushy by turns, heading home from a disappointing lunch of lo mein made with white spaghetti. The air was so sharply freezing, the meal churning so unhappily through our guts, that I longed to cheer the afternoon. I'd made up my mind the week before, but I didn't find the right moment to tell her until we were trudging through uncleared drifts in front of the former movie theater. Maggie, I said, taking her hand, I've decided. Last week's test results had exposed her declining fertility. If we wanted to do this, it had to be now. She aimed her freckled stub nose at me and studied my face. Where to get dessert? She spoke bluntly, the joke of what she really hoped in the deadness of her words. I want to have a kid with you. I meant the words to sound natural, but invested with meaning, inflected emotion on kid and you, those 2 words the sum total of my future reality. But the sentence bumbled out, awkward, half swallowed. Amazing. She spoke flatly, her unseasonable tennis shoes sinking into the slush. Why was she speaking flatly? Maggie had begged me for a kid for years. She should have jumped into my arms when I agreed. She should have fucked me right there on the boulevard, even though it was winter in Laramie, even though we're lesbians and fucking wouldn't help with getting the kid. Aren't you happy? A tear occluded one eye, but she squeezed it to a slit, squeezed both eyes closed. When she opened them, they were clear and dry. Thank you, I am happy. She sounded mechanical, but sometimes she was like that, a sweet logic robot. She waited until we stepped onto the curb on Custer Street to clamp me in a cold hug. That was it. After 5 years of debate, after crying and threatening to leave, after pointing out every child, even lumpy ones, after invoking hormones and decreased viability and geriatric pregnancies whenever worry or resentment surged through her, not to mention last week's meltdown over the test results. And now look at her, unsurprised. Maybe she figured I wouldn't have moved across the country to spend a year deciding not to have a kid with her. But I was unpredictable and stubborn. She knew better than to count on me. At 37, Maggie was 3 years older than me and beyond ready. I'd wanted to develop my career before motherhood. For the last few years, I'd drawn a comic strip about lesbian turtles. Material success with comics seemed an impossibly distant goal, safe because it would take forever. When would a comic strip about lesbian turtles ever hit the big time? Turtles are the least popular type of animal, and lesbians are the least popular type of human. But the strip launched briskly from a shabby online platform. People fell in love with the painted turtle with her red dots by each ear and the bigger soft-shelled turtle. The pilot for a TV show had been funded and shot by a new hip studio, and soon we'd move to LA. Whenever I remembered this, I shuddered. When the money for the pilot arrived, Maggie had asked to try. For years, I'd given the excuse of my career noble, logical, inarguable, and in the service, ultimately, of family. Sometimes, when I was in a certain mood, a dangerous mood maybe, or cruel, I'd speculate on scenarios where the drudgery of domestic life provided me with a larger, more startling purpose, and I could almost justify making a child in my ambivalence. What if Maggie bore twins, one with my egg and one with hers? Our kids would bond so hard in the womb that it would be like me and Maggie combining in the popular, primal way. Maggie's pinched-nosed kid stroking her lips like Maggie did, smoothing her t-shirt like Maggie did, laughing in a high key like Maggie did, falling in sibling love with my kid with dark, messy hair and skinny wrists. Did sperm banks provide an anonymous grab bag option? We could spend years gathering data on the father through the behavior of our child. He must have short eyebrows. He must like cantaloupe with pepper. He must be mean. Okay, thank you. So that's just the beginning of that story.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lydia, for reading that. And also just want to take a minute to say thank you to Sitka for having you here to talk and bringing me in to talk as well, Allison, for those intros. I'm really excited to get to talk about Rainbow with you and all of these wonderful stories. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking with me. I'm so excited.
Yeah. And I'm glad you started with Laramie Time, to the first story in the collection, because I think one of the things that story does first is it sets up a lot of your concerns around like queer domestic life, which is portrayed in not all, but many of these stories. And very often through coupledom, through couples that are, even if their perspectives aren't equal in the story, like generally one person is followed, like the narrator in this piece, the comic artist who draws the lesbian turtle comic. It's still really interesting to watch them performing this coupledom. And I guess one of my first questions for you is like, is there something in that coupling that you find interesting to write about, to think about? And then also, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about this, maybe, I don't know if obsession is the right word, but interest in queer domestic life and portraying that on the page, and like what grabs you about that for a short story.
Oh, great. Yeah, those are such great questions. I guess to start with the first one, yeah, I think a lot of the book is about, which you were kind of touching on, connection and lack of connection, and people trying to find each other and not always getting to connect in the way they hope to, because, you know, everyone is complicated and messy, and you can't always get what you want out of someone because it just doesn't work that way. So I think that interests me. It's interesting because my ex, who was also a writer, would say that she never liked to write about romantic love. And then I realized I kind of do it all the time. And it's hard to write about because it's hard to get that chemistry on the page. Sometimes I think it's often easier to write about couples when things aren't going well, in a sense, but yeah, a lot of the stories do deal with that in some way or another. And then what you were asking about queer domestic life, it just was actually one of the impetuses for writing the book for me, was just that there weren't, at the time, at least when I was starting to write this book 10, 12 years ago, there weren't a lot of media. There wasn't a lot of media out there about queer people that like aligned a lot with my experience. I felt like the media that I could find was often one certain narrative that kind of felt to me often like the cishet perspective on like queer and trans people, like Boys Don't Cry was like my favorite movie, and kind of the only movie about trans people. And of course that's a true story, but it's also like there's a certain narrative that often ends in suicide, ends in that deals with AIDS, or certain narratives that like cishet people like to continuously retell about queer people that are part of queer history, but that kind of sensationalize and punish queer people both at the same time. So I really longed for there to be more fiction that was out there that was just about like the life that I had lived, like the nuance of quotidian experience and that kind of thing, which I hadn't found. And now there's more and more books like that coming out, which is wonderful. But especially there's still not that many in comparison to like all the books that are out there. And at the time it felt like there was not really anything. So I really wanted to write a book like that.
Yeah. Oh, well, and thank you for writing it. I mean, I think it's interesting hearing you talk about it in that register, in the sense that, like, you know, it feels like initially when there were a lot of like the first maybe wave of like queer literature that came out was very in your face, like when it was, you know, able to be published and out there, it was like really erotic, and here's our desire that we can now expose, right? And then, like you're saying, like, but that's not everybody's life, right? Especially those who live maybe on the outskirts of cities or in the West or, you know, other places. And so I think that was one of the things that really spoke to me about your collection, was this other kind of life that maybe isn't quite all the like clubs and glitter and stuff like that, but is a very like different kind of way of living that is just as interesting to explore in fiction.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for saying so. Yeah, because that was definitely one of my hopes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And since we're talking about domesticity, I also really wanted to ask you about the animals that appear in your collection, because a lot of them are domesticated animals as well. There's the ferrets from Fearless Moral Inventory. There was a dog as well. There's an oxen. So a pet rat, and so they're all these pets. They're all like animals that are found on farms, domesticated in some way. And I guess I'm curious, like, well, I'd love to hear more about like your characters' relationships with animals, like why you feel called to bring in animals in that way. But then, is there a relationship between that domestication of these animals and the kind of domesticity that you're engaged in and writing about?
Ooh, I never even thought about it that way, but I think there definitely is. Like, that's so interesting. Yeah, so like the way the animals had originally come in was, I think I was originally inspired by my time fostering dogs, and I had fostered 40 different dogs over the course of 5 years in my 20s. And just one of the things that was most striking about that time for me was realizing how much humans imprint on these dogs, and how like these dogs would come to me with all these neuroses and weird behaviors, and it was like this shadow of who had owned them before and what had been done to them in the life they'd lived with that person, and just how vulnerable dogs are to being impressed upon by the people that are trying to take care of them. And so I was thinking a lot about like how we as humans used to kind of rely on animals so much, like, you know, back in the olden times, like, you know, horses and cows and having chickens and blah, blah, blah. And animals aren't as much still a part of our daily lives, but I wanted to kind of explore all the different ways that animals still do enter our lives and impact our lives. So like the rat you mentioned is like a source of comfort for a character. And then the ferrets are sort of a purpose, giving someone who's going through a journey with sobriety a purpose and like love, and trying to have her kind of have something to live for that's going to help her not relapse. So the different, and they're actually like the original project of the book at the very beginning, there was like a different animal in every story. And there was a stinky flying squirrel that was in Cheerful Until Next Time, but my editor said I should remove it because there were too many animals. But there's other stories that didn't make it into the book. There was like a story about these teens searching for ambergris, which is a kind of very valuable whale vomit. And so that's kind of a shadow project that lurks in the book that sometimes people notice. But yeah, I think it's interesting what you say about the domestication of the animals being like kind of aligning with the domestication of queer people, because it's definitely something that like, I don't know, as me personally, as a queer person, like I didn't really think I would get to be domesticated, that I would get to like have a family, have a partner, have a house, have a normal job, because it just felt like there weren't those role models. And it just felt like, what is my future but like a black wildness of terror and unimaginability, because there weren't really people in my community that were normal queer people living a domestic life. And I think that was also a larger cultural fear, especially around like legalizing marriage. Like, is this something we want to do? Like, do we have an opportunity to like have our community have a different trajectory, rather than kind of trying to get these kind of rights that we're supposed to want to have? So I think that that is definitely in there to a degree.
Totally. That's so fascinating to hear you talk about. And you know, what's interesting is that a lot of the characters, or some of the characters at least, are, you know, they're not all totally like comfortable with that domestication either. So there's a lot of like internal struggling. And I know you were saying, you mentioned earlier that you were thinking of reading a bit from Pioneer, I think it was.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe now might be a good time we could talk a little bit
great.
more about that story after.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I will read from the story Pioneer from the middle of the book. The Oregon Trail ran from the back entrance of Bridge Elementary down through the schoolyard to the edge of the woods. Cones marked the journey. Not the satisfying soft cones that squish down with your body weight, but hard plastic cones, prim and pointed as shark teeth. The cones looped around the tree line to the right, and that's all Coco and the rest of the Culver family could see from the starting point. Who knew where the trail went after that? There were dangers, Coco had heard, though she didn't know exactly what. When Miss Harper had passed out the simulation's rainbow-coated biography cards last week, Coco had not been assigned to the Culver family. Her lemon yellow card listed her as the matriarch of the Bell family, who had lived right here in historic Lexington, Massachusetts. While the class wandered around collecting their families, Coco asked Devin, the Bell patriarch, if she could be a child in the Bell family instead. We already have 2 children, Devin said, and there can't be children without a matriarch. Sure there can, said Coco. The matriarch could have died. They'd make up some woman who'd long since perished. Recalling her benevolence could pass the time on the trail. You want to be dead? Asked Devin. No, Coco said. I just don't want to be the Bell matriarch. I want to be a Bell child. Why? Coco wouldn't say so to Devin, but she was uneasy in dresses and skirts. The wind could catch the fabric and expose the part of her she hated most, that felt so wrong and that she pretended had withered off her. In the role of a child, she'd be an 1800s tomboy. As matriarch, there was no option. She'd have to look like a full woman. Ever since Coco's body had started developing a few months ago, she focused hard on the mildew on the ceiling while she washed herself in order to forget her body. Only when the water was dirtied and lathered with soap could she bear to look down. At first, Coco considered not traveling the Oregon Trail at all, but that would be a crazy move. Coco loved Miss Harper and would never lie to her. But beyond that, the Oregon Trail was the culmination of the fifth graders' hard work through Bridge Elementary, where you got to be a pioneer like those who traipsed around Plymouth Rock. All through middle and high school, the Oregon Trail would be reminisced about as the pinnacle of their education. The day before the Oregon Trail, Coco asked the other families in Miss Harper's class if she could join up with them. Do you need a baby? She asked the Murdaughs and the Hancocks, the Bakers and the Blackthorns, or an adolescent? No, they said, if they bothered with her at all. Even though it was still regular school until tomorrow, the families were already insular and protective, clumping around desks between subjects. Aren't you a matriarch yourself? The Blackthorn matriarch asked. I don't want to be, said Coco. I want to be a kid. That's stupid. Miss Harper says we have to accept our station. Yeah, said the Blackthorn son, who blew his nose on his math worksheets. Matriarchy is an incredible honor. Women rule. Want to trade? Coco asked. Doy, no. Coco's best option was to join the Culver family, who offered her the role of an ox. You can pull our wagon, said Alex, the Culver family patriarch. If you can find another ox, we'll yoke you. It'll be super. What she wanted to be was a boy, like Devin or Alex, but nice. She wanted to wear short pants and follow behind a party, providing for anyone who was hungry. She wanted to be a smooth-faced, short-haired, colonial boy. At home that night, Coco stuffed yellow felt triangles with dry grass for horns and affixed them to the cap of her headgear. She prepared a poncho that simulated the powerful shoulders of an animal and tied a piece of rope to her belt for a tail. Coco, her mom said, I thought you were a matriarch. Lately, Coco hated the sound of her own name, which was like a pet's name or the name of a girl with makeup in a Western saloon, embarrassingly girlish, the verbal equivalent of balloon staple to her chest. She twitched like she'd been hit. I used to be. You look like, I don't want to say it. What? Coco struggled to speak clearly. Although her headgear was for night use only, she'd hooked the mouthpiece into the metal tubes on her molars. Otherwise, the cap didn't stay taut on her head. What do I look like? Her horns flapped over her eyes. Her mom didn't answer. The next day, all 4 fifth grade classes lined up at the head of the Oregon Trail. People were meticulously dressed. The matriarchs wore full hoop skirts and aprons, bonnets and bodices with puffy sleeves, colonial dirt rubbed purposefully on the hemlines. The fathers and uncles wore leather vests and hats. The boys wore breeches. The families pulled red wagons and garden carts and wheelbarrows to which they'd attached hula hoops with sheets over them like genuine covered wagons. Everyone must have been gathering materials since kindergarten. Coco snuck between the families in Mr. Bennett's class and Miss Goldberg's class and Mrs. Hedgerow's class. Everyone stared. Are you a dog? Someone asked, with headgear. Are you an alien? You look gay, said Devin, the Bell patriarch, who stood with a radio flyer and 2 motherless children. What do you mean? Coco asked. Like a gay person? Ever heard of one? They're actually real. It's sick. I'll stop there.
Thank you for reading that. I mean, if folks haven't gotten your book yet, finishing that story would be a chief reason to go out and get it, I would say. It's a wonderful story, the choice to set it, this recreation of the Oregon Trail in Massachusetts and at a Massachusetts like middle school, basically, is just such a microcosm of like all the cruelties that can play out both in a school and among children, not to mention on the Oregon Trail itself. And I'm really glad that you read the section that you did, because that interaction between Coco and her mother was one that really, stood out to me upon reading that story. I mean, Coco, I feel for her so much, and just watching her try to wrestle with this role she's been assigned. I think that's maybe you like tapped into a really kind of universal queer experience with that story, because I wonder if most queer people can remember a time, in school where they were assigned some kind of role that really clashed in a way that they weren't able to verbalize yet. And, she goes and chooses to dress up as the oxen to escape that role, but then also can't at the same time. And so there's so much tension there. But then the moment where the mother can't verbalize also like what it is that her daughter looks like to her was such a moving moment to me. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that choice to not verbalize it there, because I feel like a lesser writer might have given something to the audience or to the reader and been like, oh yeah, this is what she looks like. But I love that you hold back that information from us. And if you don't, maybe, I know not everything has like a reason behind it, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think, well, both with the mother and with Miss Harper, who's the teacher who ends up kind of, you can tell she's kind of on Coco's side, but both the mother and the teacher, they have no access to what's actually going on for Coco, even though they're not like antagonistic figures. Like they didn't assign Coco the role of a matriarch to make her uncomfortable or have any idea would make her uncomfortable. And I wanted to kind of show that even if growing up as a queer person, like there are people around you who, there could have been people around you who had their heart in the right place, were trying to do the right thing, trying to be supportive of the kid that you were in any way they could, but still could leave you feeling very alone and isolated and dealing with your own thing because there wasn't language for them to access. Like there wasn't any, especially in the time when the story was set in like the mid 90s, like there just wasn't any awareness of what it meant to be a trans kid, what resources could be available for a trans kid. They didn't exist any resources. Even if the kid wasn't trans and was, queer in some other way, it's like adults don't necessarily read sexuality always into kids or think about them as being dealing with that. And so I wanted to show that even if kids were in a situation that wasn't like abusive or hateful or homophobic, transphobic, there was still a lot of loneliness and hard things in that way too.
And I think that comes through beautifully, and which leads to another question that I had about childhood and queer youth. I think it's interesting in that, and I've worked with queer youth in the past, but also was a queer youth before you're a queer youth, right? So like, I guess and you write about queer childhood and about these young characters so beautifully. And I'm really curious to hear like how you have kept in touch with kind of that aspect of being young and being queer. And as you've grown older, like, do you feel farther away from those feelings? And was it more difficult to access writing about those feelings? We just met for the first time today, so I don't know much about like your personal life or family life, or if you have kids or anything like that. So, but yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about in my own work. And I'd really love to hear a little bit from you about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think like, for me, there's kind of two answers to the question. And part of it is that I do feel very connected still to that time in my life. I think because so much happened in that time that was formative and that led to me realizing things about my identity and whatnot, that impacted and imprinted on me in really intense ways. So I think for that reason, it's crystal clear for me. I also have like a chillingly accurate memory. Like I'm always freaking people out because I'm like, oh hey Ben, how's your pet weasel or something? And they're like, wait, I literally have no idea who you are. And I like just remember things about people that they don't, that's very unsettling. So I think my first memory that I can timestamp is from when I was 2. So I just have like good memories for that time. And I think because so much happened in that time, I'm like more aware than maybe some other people are about how complex that time is and how like kids are not just, innocent angels who don't understand anything, but they have this deep awareness. Even if they have also confusion, there's complex awarenesses and complex feelings and emotions going on that it's easier to think don't exist in kids, I think, sometimes, because it's like, you don't want to think that kids are going through those kinds of things, but they are. And so I feel like I'm able to write about kids in a way that isn't like either like super innocent, you know, whitewash kind of version of them. But in terms of like keeping in touch with real youth, like, so I do have 2 trans nibblings who, you know, came out before me and went through transitions before me, and so I got to really be like learning from them and looking up to them, even though they're so much younger than me, which was like a cool moment. And then inspired one of the stories that's also in the collection. Honey talks about you know, how there's this weird reversal where like people who are younger than our generation are kind of creating this discourse that then we're learning from, and they're figuring, they have more access to resources and whatnot, so they've been able to kind of move faster in their journeys than people who are older. So there's that. And then I also taught for a number of summers at a writing camp. I think actually somebody from it is at this event, but where there, for some reason, I guess because it's like, who wants to choose to study writing over the summer? For some reason, there's a lot of queer kids. So I got to see like, wow, like the sort of identity markers that kids are feeling comfortable using. Not to say everything's so easy now for them. There's lots of other problems that have blossomed with social media and whatnot. But in terms of visibility, I did get to see like how things were changing so much for young people.
Oh, cool. That's so great. And you know, as you were answering those questions, I was thinking, and I was worrying, I was like, oh, you know, sometimes it's a fraught question for fiction writers, like, you know, how much of their own life is in their stories. And like, you know, but you do have stories where your narrators are also reflecting on like what they're going to write down later in a story. So there is an element of that metafictionalness. It's Pink Knives, I think, right? Which is where the writer is experiencing the thing and then also simultaneously sort of writing the narrative in their head. And I want to ask more questions, or I want to get to the point where you're going to read a little bit from Sunny Talks, because I think that's one of that might be my favorite story in the collection. But I wanted to ask you though, really quickly, about that relationship for you between like reality and fiction, like when you're composing, and you know, is that something that you feel is always there for you to access when you're writing these stories and drawing from for characters? Or is there like do you share that perspective of the Pink Knives narrator, or is it feel a little different for you?
Like when I'm just going through my life, is that what you mean exactly?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, I think, different ways to ask that question, but you know, I mean, many of your stories are very realist. They're engaged in the real world. You know, yes, they're funny, they're imaginative, they're doing lots of things, but we don't take like a big step away from reality with them. And also, it seems like there are aspects from your own life that inform some of these stories. So I guess I'm just curious to hear a little bit about like how you draw from your own life when you're writing or thinking up an idea for a story.
Oh yeah, that it kind of works in many different ways. So like, yeah, all of the stories have aspects from my real life, and none of them are 100% true in any way. Like even ones where it seems like, oh, this might be true, they're not. It's like kind of a lie. So yeah, and I've tried to write nonfiction in the past, and I've done a little bit, but I struggle with it because as soon as I start writing, I'm like making stuff up, and then it's like, oh dang, this isn't nonfiction anymore. But yeah, so it comes in different ways. Like for example, the second story in the book, The Black Winter of New England, like that was drawn from a time in my life in middle school where a lot of crazy things happen, and I'm not in touch with any of the people. I just actually through this book got in touch with my best friend from that time, which was amazing, but I hadn't been in touch with a single person. Some of them had died from overdoses. Some of them like had a baby as a teen and disappeared. One of them is married to a police officer. So it was just like they all went into these very different directions, and I never heard from any of them again. So I kind of wanted to work through that time and think through what it meant and all the crazy things that had happened then. But then the way it plays out, like there was never an actual New Year's party. Like I never took a rat. So lots of things are fictionalized, but and then Sunny Talks, like I wanted to write about sort of the essence of my relationship with my nibblings, but Sunny is like nothing like either of my nibblings. The main character is not a lot like me. So it was kind of like the essence of that relationship and how it plays out and its broader kind of political, social implications. So yeah, and then sometimes it's like little anecdotes. So like, for example, in Counselor of My Heart, you mentioned the dog earlier, and there's a dog that meets a tragic accident in the first paragraph of that story. That's actually the thing that people are the most disturbed about.
I'm sure.
It's just funny because so much intense things happen, and that's the thing that's the most upsetting. But the way that happened,
Lydia's frozen. Callum, thank you so much for your moderation. I'm just so enjoying the conversation and hearing your voice, and excited to read more of your work as well. Callum, what are you working on right now?
I was working on a novel, but was pulling my hair out over that. So now I'm back to short stories and feeling more in the groove there. I write kind of magical realist short stories. And again, a lot about like the natural world and queer and trans characters' relationships with the natural world too. So that's sort of where I'm at these days. But I got a lot from Lydia's book, and again, the way that they treat like animals in relationship to queer characters in this book, I think was really fascinating. Like we were talking about in the beginning. There's so much here. They're so rich, these stories.
Yeah, somehow I got kicked off of the internet. That's so weird.
Well, we're glad to have you back. And maybe you could read a bit from Sunny Talks.
Oh yeah, I'd be glad to
Launch us off. And then I have at least another question for you about that. And then we can open up some questions from folks who are visiting. Can either drop them in whatever box they can drop them in, Q&A or chat or whatever it is. But yeah, go for it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Callum. Okay, so this is from Sunny Talks. Hunched over my computer in my cubicle, I prepare for my nephew's visit by watching one of his YouTube videos. His backdrop is his bedroom, the walls painted black, centaur and mermaid posters freshly hung. His mascots, he calls them. He pops into the frame, flaunting his naked, scar-free chest. He's 15, but looks 10. His wrists are so frail, his shoulders so narrow, that I worry that he'll break his arms with his eager, sweeping gestures. His audience is 10 or 20,000 people who litter his page with rainbow emojis, kissing emojis, shining sun emojis, interrupted by trolls reminding him he's a damaged and mutilated female. Welcome to Sunny's channel. He rolls his eyes like everyone knows already. Sunny was always his name, so when people threaten to publish his real name, he has a laugh, thrusting his head back against the wall of his bedroom, which is beside my older sister's bedroom in their little house in Shrewsbury, though Sunny doesn't reveal where he dispatches from. He's learned from millennial elders on the platform at least the basics of safe internet practices. He lifts the rabbit my sister bought him and holds it to the camera, pink pad swelling to blot out the screen. The rabbit died a few months after this video of nose cancer. My assistant, Sunny says, Almond Sr. He bounces the rabbit's haunches, pronouns, they, them. He snorts. Almond Sr.'s non-binary. The rabbit's cute, cancer-filled nose presses against Sunny's cute little boy nose. So trendy now, aren't you? I pull back from the screen into the green light of the office. I've watched the video a dozen times, awaiting this moment, my breath so quick it's audible, perking my ears for Sunny's tone.
Is the joke that the rabbit has an identity, or is the joke that the identity is non-binary? Sunny crops the frame at his waist as though he has hips to hide. He updates his perspective regularly on crucial queer Gen Z issues such as pansexuality, passing privilege, cisnormativity, he/him lesbians, PGPs, chasers, and demi-romanticism. He applies gel to his hair so it crests sweetly over his forehead, a neighbor boy from a 50s sitcom. I live hundreds of miles from Sunny now, but this evening my sister will drop him at my apartment in Trenton. Tomorrow, Sunny and I will attend a convention of trans YouTubers in Philadelphia. Sunny invited me a few weeks back, explaining that it wasn't cool to go with his mom, that he preferred me, his aunt, which was fishy because he loves my sister, but I guess everyone grows up sometime. Last week, he sent a video message of himself singing Streets of Philadelphia with a plastic bell, the crack drawn on in Sharpie, nested in his soft disc of hair, and a portrait of Ben Franklin taped to the wall behind. I pat my blouse to absorb the sweat from my palms. Tonight, I'll discuss my identity with Sunny, tell him what's been true my whole life, though only now is there language for it. I hate to burden a kid with my issues, but he is the only trans person I know. The write-up, Eric says, looming over my desk. My colleagues don't look directly at me, as though I could infect them through the eyes, but I hold out hope that Eric could become a friend. He visits my desk instead of emailing me. His earring is either queer or cheesy, same with his spiked, thinning hair. Once I'm more comfortable in my body, I'll ask him for a drink at the sports bar. I pinch the report from my printer tray and clap it into a folder. Eric snatches the file as though I'll change my mind.
Yay, thank you. Like I said, I think this is my favorite story from the collection, and we're starting to get some questions come into the Q&A button. So, and I'll get to those in just a minute. I was so excited when I started reading Sunny Talks because, you know, I'm 33, so I was transitioning in this moment of early YouTube days, and I was watching those YouTube videos, and I was like a little older than the people who were making them, but it was so cool to see this experience reflected in a short story, in a literary short story, you know, where I had never seen that before. So it was really exciting to me to read that. And then also what's really great about it though is that it's not told through Sunny's point of view, right? It's told through the point of view of the aunt. And of course, now you've given us a little more context saying that you are the aunt to two nibblings, which is very cool. But it strikes me that a lot of your stories are kind of, it's like they're coming at the queerness from a different angle, right? They're almost like queering the perspective from which they are approaching queerness, in the sense that they're usually not told from the point of view of like the main character of it, you know, which you could argue would be Sunny, or in another story, right? There's Kim, who's the young girl who was bullied at her old school for having a crush on a girl, and but that story is not told through her point of view. It's told from her friend who's like obsessed with her. So it seems like there's a lot of that, and I guess I'd be curious to know, you know, is that an intentional kind of strategy that you use, or is that sort of inherent in your approach to writing fiction? Is this sort of going around the side, or how do you arrive at that perspective in this story?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it like that, but yeah, I think there's a lot. I think part of it is like, I'm curious, I'm interested in that position of someone who's like in a moment where they like know something is up with them, but they haven't quite figured out what it is, or they know what it is, but they're not ready to say it. So like, for example, Heidi in the story you mentioned, who's obsessed with her best friend Kim, who is an out lesbian, and Heidi's sexuality is like only emerging slowly throughout the story. But it just interests me, like when there is, someone who's more out. And I don't know, I think it's because like I have had a slightly different journey of queer. I mean, like I was out as like bisexual and like whatever bisexual when I was like 12 and stuff, so that was early. But then like I didn't have like top surgery until like 2 years ago, and like didn't change my pronouns until a few years before that. So like that felt different. And I think I always felt like, oh, maybe I don't have the norm, the like more normal experience that people have of like gender identity kind of journey. So I think I've often been in the role of someone who's like looking at someone who seems like they have it more figured out. They probably frankly don't, and have a lot of struggles that aren't evident, but like trying to like find my own way through their experience kind of, or like looking to it for a model, even though sometimes the model doesn't fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. That's a great way to put it, I think. Thank you for being so open about that. So yeah, there's a question in the Q&A, and I think it kind of relates a little bit to what you're talking about now. So Linda asks, do either or both of you feel an expectation or obligation to address queer experience in your writing? How do you negotiate that? Great question.
Well, for me, like I basically want to be addressing that, and like that's my main kind of interest, but the way that it does sometimes feel like an obligation or an anxiety for me is when sometimes people, and I wonder, Callum, if you've had this experience too, like people want queer people or people in my community wanting to see like a certain representation, which maybe is like a positive representation, or like, oh, since there aren't that many queer trans writers, like your characters should be like, not that everyone thinks this way, but they should be like unimpeachable, heroic, blah blah blah. And to me, like, I'm interested in fiction, writing a perfect, I'm not perfect, I think if you're queer or trans, you probably have had some issues along the way, because it's not an easy journey, and it's certainly not something you can do unimpeachably, because it's just hard. And it's like, if you've had a hard time, it's harder to be a perfect person. So I sometimes feel a pressure, which may be somewhat in my head and somewhat real, that, oh, these characters should be like heroes, but I'm not interested in writing about that. I don't feel it's realistic. But Callum, I'm curious what you think about that.
Oh, yeah. I think if I'm being honest, I do sometimes feel some friction with that expectation. But I tend to get around it by having my characters, like transition into mountains or introduce dragons into a story or something. And that usually satisfies both me and I think, hopefully others. I can't speak for them, but yeah. Let's see. So the next, there's a congratulations to you from Lanny, who looks forward to getting the book. And maybe there's another question too, but I was just thinking, when you were saying that you're interested in writing about these more complex queer characters, is that a vein that you feel like you're still going down with, like what you're writing now? And that, do you feel like there's more to go and to explore in this kind of realm of these characters who don't have it all figured out, who are kind of muddling through life in the same way?
Definitely. Yeah. Like in the novel I'm working on, the main character is on a journey and is not doing a great job getting there. So she's kind of hurting people and messing up along the way. And so, yeah, it is something I'm definitely interested in continuing to explore.
I can't wait for that. That sounds great. Let's see. Ryan asks they ask, which books or writers have helped you find your literary voice or envision a place for yourself? Do you often, and a follow-up, do you often find yourself in dialogue with other writers exploring ecology or sense of place through the lens of queerness?
Ooh, interesting. So when I was younger, like, reading was a huge part of me, like trying to envision a place for myself in the world. And I remember reading a lot of books which had featured queer children, though they weren't like actively queer, but you could just tell if you were a queer child, you could recognize yourself in them. So for example, like books by Carson McCullers, Harper Lee, like To Kill a Mockingbird. I feel like Scout is queer, and you know, Dorothy Allison I love. So any kind of queer thing that I could find helped me so much. I'm trying to think though of the second question. I'm not sure. Callum, do you have thoughts about that, of ecology through the lens of queerness? But that's so interesting.
I think that, I mean, I feel like right now there are a lot of writers or queer writers who are exploring place and ecology through queerness or through their trans identity. And so we're kind of in this exciting moment now. Like Isha Sabatini Sloan is somebody who's doing that in a really interesting way in nonfiction. Fiction wise, who else is doing that? Emrys Donaldson, they don't have a book yet, but they will someday soon, I'm sure. And then I edit a journal that publishes trans writers who write queer about nature and the natural world. So I do have some access to that, but that wasn't like always the case. I think that's a more recent thing that like publishers and people are realizing, is that those are two natural bedfellows, is like queer writers and the natural world. And I think for me, though, the writers that I kind of came up with and who inspired me were more often like immigrant writers, whether that was because they felt alienated from the place where they grew up from, or alienated in the new nation in which they found themselves. There was a lot of just like alienation to relate to, and that came through, and that I also recognized in other areas of my life, even though I don't share that identity. So like Reynaldo Arenas was a Cuban writer, gay Cuban writer, who died in 1990, but and whose writing has been really formative for me. So I would say that that's where I've gotten most of my kind of influences from. Let's see. One of the things I was wondering too, though, Lydia, was if we can come back to maybe that notion of like domesticity and kind of come full circle here for a minute. I guess I'm curious if, in the vein of some of your characters, like, do you ever feel kind of friction with that? Like you'd mentioned earlier about when the debate was on about like gay marriage, and if that was something that like we should have, and like, are we just assimilating if we're kind of jumping on board with that? And I mean, I'm married now, so it's like, you know, in some sense you get older and you capitulate to some of these things, but as a writer, I think it's still an interesting vein to be mining. And I guess I'm curious to hear, like, you know, where you're at personally in that realm, kind of, if you're open to sharing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like at the time when marriage was being debated, I was like, it should 100% be legalized, because, you know, there are so many different types of queer people, and some of them need security and need to be a bad thing, and people can just choose not to do it. But then like when it comes into practice, like it's just something that I found like I was personally uncomfortable with. So like I'm glad if people have the option to do it, but then it was like, and I don't think it's necessarily a stance like I think it's bad. It's just like hard for me, like after having thought I wouldn't get to have it, to like accept that I could. It was like a personal struggle for me. And that's like something that I've also thought about a lot, is sometimes people, not so much now, but like especially pre-Trump, people would say like, oh, it's fine to be queer now, like it's not a big deal, like why are you moaning about it, or like writing about the hard parts? And it's like, well, even if that was true and it was 100% fine to be queer and anywhere you went everyone would accept you, which never has been the case, then people are still walking around with all this trauma from like their whole lives, people telling them it wasn't okay. So it doesn't just erase when things are legalized or whatnot. So I think that's something that sometimes people don't understand who are outside of the community. I think there's more awareness now that queer rights are more under attack these days again, but yeah, that's something that struck me.
Yeah, thank you. And let's see, we have two more questions in here. One is a comment that suggests checking out the book Queer Ducks and Other Animals by Elliot Schrafer, which I'm not familiar with, so thank you, Jenna.
That's cool.
And then another question from Linda here, which is a very great and practical question about craft, which I haven't asked you much about. So thank you, Linda. They say, I would love to hear how both of you structure your writing process / practice. Daily, weekly, monthly routines? Ooh, yes.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I personally write every day. I start writing in the morning, and then I write basically until something else I have to do, which is, you know, sometimes noon. I don't know, whatever I have a job thing. My job can a lot take place in the afternoon and evening, but yeah, so and then my one weird thing about writing process is I write on a treadmill, so I'm always walking while I'm writing.
Wow.
Because I'm like a very restless person, so that helps me a lot to focus. In terms of like the larger process, like on the sort of macro level that Linda's asking about, like I do tend to cycle back to projects. So like stories in this book, some of them took like 10 years to write, but it would be like I would leave them for years sometimes, or months, while I worked on other stuff, and then keep cycling back through them to get sort of fresh eyes on them. So I'm always in sort of some kind of a cycle with everything I'm working on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the same for me. I don't know, I have any nuggets of wisdom to add to that. That sounds like a much healthier practice, standing and walking while writing instead of being stationary. That's great. Thank you for those questions. And I believe that we are at 5 o'clock on the dot here. Thank you, Lydia, for this conversation, for answering these. Oh, is there one more question? Can't tell.
Oh, do you write analog or digitally? I write on the computer because I move so much stuff around. I wish I could write by hand, but
yeah, same. Sometimes I'll write by hand if I'm stuck on something and really need to like get it out. But I don't have a lot of wherewithal to then put it on the computer and type over what I've already written. It's kind of exhausting.
yeah.
Well, I am really looking forward to your novel, to what it's coming next. And just thank you so much to you, to Sitka, and Allison. I don't know if you want to hop on and say something more, but yeah, thank you so much, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Callum and Allison, so much. This has been such a fun conversation.
I had I took a European novel course from my favorite lit professor at college, and we read a bunch of French authors first and then shifted to Dickens. And she did a couple things. She had people raise their hands, like, did you like the French stuff more or the Dickens more? And then she asked, now raise your hands if you're more of a cat person or a dog person. And all the cat people liked the Flaubert, and all of the dog people liked the Dickens. And I've just been reflecting on that as I've been listening to this conversation. She preferred the Dickens and described the shift from reading the French authors that are more omniscient to the Dickens, like you suddenly feel like you're in a giant leather easy chair, just like right there by the fire. And that's how I've felt during this conversation. It's just been so warm and intimate and surprising and deep, and just what a privilege to get to hear both of your voices and hear your conversation. And Lydia, especially, thank you so much for reading out loud. It always just feels like such a gift to me when human beings read stories out loud together. And thank you. Also, there are so many past residents who logged on for this conversation. So just so exciting when we bring these conversations virtually, how it connects the Sitka residency community and instructor community in ways that we just never were able to support on our campus. So just grateful for the whole audience. Callum, what a wonderful job. Lydia, so grateful for your reading. Thank you, both of you. Anything else either of you want to say? This is the worst part. So in an in-person, like we would say, good night, but then everyone would still keep talking, and instead we're going to press this horrible button and everyone's going to disappear, and
Yeah.
Callum won't get to say anything to Lydia, and it's the only part I don't like about the online talks. But
Uh, oh no, just thank you, Lydia, for trusting someone you never met to come on and talk to you about your book and ask you questions about your stories. That was very warm and trusting of you, and congrats on no longer being in the wintry place. And you're now in Tennessee. You're saying there's, when you were reading Laramie Time, it starts with snow, and there's really this sort of forbidding snowy thread through a lot of this collection. So I'm very happy for you that you're now no longer in a snowy place.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, and thank you so much, Callum, for reading my book and your insightful questions, and thank you for everyone for coming too. I saw many friendly faces in the group, and it's so nice to see you there.
thank you, Callum Angus. Thank you, Lydia Conklin, and congratulations on Rainbow. Thanks, Sitka community, and we wish you season's greetings and a great night. Thanks, everybody.